Hola y gracias por acompañarnos esta noche. Mi nombre es Zespo y soy el coordinador del programa del Comité de Práctica Abierta. Hello and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. My name is Zespo and I'm the program coordinator of the Open Practice Committee. El Departamento de Artes Visuales reconoce que nuestro evento de esta noche, número 191 del Comité de Práctica Abierta, tiene lugar en las tierras tradicionales del Consejo de Tres Hogueras, las naciones Ojibwe, Odawa, y Potawatomi. The Department of Visual Arts acknowledges that our event tonight, number 191 of the Open Practice Committee, takes place on the traditional homelands of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. Hoy, nuestro campo se encuentra entre un rastro de búfalo histórico y un gran cuerpo de agua. Ahora como entonces, esta tierra es un sitio de comercio, reunión y residencia para muchas personas. Reconocemos como nuestras carreteras, líneas de trenes y autopistas actuales deben un linaje a esta infraestructura temprana, así como el poder histórico de la institución para desplazar a varios de los que se han establecido aquí y le han llamado a esta tierra circundante su hogar. Today, our campus sits between a historic buffalo trail and a great body of water. Now is that this land is a site of trade, gathering, and residence for many people. We acknowledge how our current roads, train lines, and expressways owe a lineage to this early infrastructure, as well as the historic power of the institution in displacing a number of those who have settled here and called this surrounding land home. El producto de 6 generaciones de pastores luteranos que se extienden hasta Noruega. John Preus creció en Tanzania con misioneros luteranos que luego influyó su forma de pensar sobre los materiales, la apropiación, la posibilidad de valores compartidos y el choque de culturas. The product of 6 generations of Lutheran pastors stretching back to Norway, John Preus grew up in Tanzania, to Lutheran missionaries, which influenced how he thinks about materials, appropriation, the possibility of shared values, and the clash of cultures. Preus desarrolló su práctica multidisciplinaria a partir de sus raíces tanto en la pintura como en la fabricación de muebles, que se entrelazó en su trabajo colaborativo con Material Exchange en la escuela de posgrado aquí en la Universidad de Chicago. Preus developed his multidisciplinary practice from roots in both painting and furniture making, which became entwined in his collaborative work with Material Exchange in graduate school here at the University of Chicago. Desde entonces, Preus ha sido intérprete residente en el Smart Museum, residente de Kaplan en la Northwestern University, residente de Jackman Goldwasser en el Hyde Park Art Center, y su trabajo ha sido incluido en muchas colecciones públicas y privadas. Preus has since been interpreter in residence at the Smart Museum, a Kaplan resident at Northwestern University, a Jackman Goldwasser resident at the Hyde Park Art Center, and has had his work included in many public and private collections. También es un fabricante de otros artistas y diseñadores, lo que han influido en sus pensamientos sobre la autoría y la colaboración. He is also a fabricator for other artists and designers, which has influenced his thoughts on authorship and collaboration. Por favor, acompáñenme en darle la bienvenida de regreso a Doba, John Preus. Please join me in welcoming back to Doba, John Preus.
Okay, first of all, enormous thank you and gratitude to Zespo and OPC for inviting me to speak. As he mentioned, I got my MFA here from what was then the committee, on the visual arts in 2005, and it's nice to see familiar faces here. I've been working since in Chicago. Many of you will remember Bob Peters, a UC great from my time here. He gave me the advice, be a good writer, that a significant part of developing and growing a practice includes finding a way to write about what you do. I've tried to take this advice to heart. Laura Latinsky is also here, a great advisor from my years here, to whom I owe tremendous debt, gratitude. So I want to talk about a set of relationships that I'm drawing out from a longer overview of my work, going back a long ways in some places. It's not in chronological order. It is stitched together according to the theme I'm exploring as I see it running through the work. So basically reading from a text, and then I'll stop and kind of describe some of what you're seeing on the screen. I've had occasion to experience powerful emotions over the past few years, a condition I spent my life avoiding. It has had the effect of producing eruptions of childhood memories. The one that emerged was a memory of the first homeless person I'd ever seen and the overwhelming sadness that came with it. I couldn't understand why the whole world didn't just stop what it was doing immediately and attend to the person. And further, to wonder who would take care of me if I were in that position. I remember asking my parents if he could come home with us and sleep on the couch. I've seen a similar incomprehension in my own children, the deeply unsettling but humanizing identification with the suffering of others. As people do, I slowly learned to bracket those emotions, to not care so much that I couldn't function, or to at least compartmentalize the emotions, so that eventually I could witness suffering and feel very little. It is the somewhat perverse condition of being human. Part of what governs my interest in the nature of emotional life is that the family I grew up in didn't put much emphasis or attention on emotions on the one hand, combined with a sense that I am personally chained to my own emotions and they impact my life profoundly, which has inspired a desire to understand them much better. The underlying ethos in my family was something like, do the right thing. It's not for you to worry about how you feel about it. And I think the avoidance of emotion has merit in certain ways. Emotions are contagious, attached to the reptile brain from millennia of sublingual communication to alert each other to danger. Our emotions are necessarily tribal, and the Lutheran Christian aversion to them reflects some awareness of their mimetic quality. Nonetheless, ignoring them produces other problems. This process is one which every human undergoes to some degree to avoid being crushed under the total weight of suffering in the universe. There are all manner of responses to this sort of suffering, individual and collective, but it seems to demand an object and a cause. Suffering cannot but come to rest somewhere. These are two masks from students at Sullivan High School, where I did a residency a couple of years ago, working with school materials. One of the primary functions of religion is that it channels the diffuse and varied subjective versions of suffering into some formal practice designed to give meaning to it. It acknowledges the contagious nature of emotions and proposes a humanizing force to navigate them. Without a means of framing the normal suffering of being alive within some redemptive narrative, it will metastasize into social malignancy. This is an altar and lectern made from a cherry tree brought down by a storm. There's a Christian idea characterized by the story The Ragman by Walter Wangerow Jr., in which the messianic figure of the ragman takes on the suffering of others by putting on their clothing. So the ragman removes a bandage from the head of another and puts it on himself, taking on her wound. Every night the ragman dies of the vicarious wounds he has endured, then gets up again the next morning, folds the rags and goes back out into the world. The death and rebirth factor, as with the Christian story, has something to do with this capacity of humans to absorb some amount of vicarious suffering and transform it. The absorption part happens pretty naturally, as social media well knows. It is what happens once we have been possessed that is in question. Mushrooms are able to do something similar, to take rotting flesh and pollution and process it internally, producing a fruit that is actually edible. The fascination with the power of mushrooms has depths in religion. There's a fascinating interpretation on the Christian story called The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross by linguist John Allegro, who was one of a handful of scholars granted access to the Dead Sea Scrolls. The book theorizes that the Bible is actually a coded text describing the beliefs and rituals of a mushroom cult, and that Jesus was a code name for a psychedelic mushroom. Even the story of Santa Claus, the flying sleigh, the reindeer, the red and white, the whole array of Christmas themes also seem to have some roots in the human fascination with mushrooms. But that is an aside, simply to further ground my own interest in the structure of the story of the death and rebirth cycles. And I imagine this material, this is a shot of the storage facility where I stored 6 semi-loads of furniture from closed public schools in 2013. A lot of the work that you'll see is related to this. And I imagine the furniture in some ways like compost. Jesus was sometimes called the man of sorrows, whose mission it was broadly construed to take on the suffering of the world without crippling himself. The quote from the monastery of St. Paul in Greece, "If you die before you die, then you will not die when you die," is a beautiful and haunting suggestion about the aspirations of religious practice. My work with broken things has been a way of engaging with the conversation around death and rebirth, trauma and redemption, and where to locate these conversations within mundane daily experience. There can be a masochistic psychological dimension to the idea of taking on someone else's wounds or celebrating one's own as if victimhood confers some kind of social status. While I am inclined to think that this is a primary moral objective of humanity, to find ways to transform one's own suffering and thereby the suffering around you, the procedure for doing so is the subject of our earliest writings. This piece is called Trauma Bonding, frame made from school materials fitted to found glass panel to house the sawdust produced by making the frame. If the ragman, through magical empathy, is able to relieve suffering in others, a more contemporary position might be that taking away someone else's suffering is neither possible nor desirable. This is called Stoop 7, Found Textiles, Outgrown Children's Clothing. In the psychological literature, there's a syndrome called secondary or vicarious trauma, a kind of PTSD in which the victim, often a caregiver or family member, suffers symptoms of a trauma that they did not themselves experience. Seat cushions by Karen Reimer, markings found on the school furniture transposed and embroidered onto seat cushions. The artist is here in the audience. Or worse, there's a new and disturbing field of group psychology called epigenetics, which explores the ways and degrees to which trauma is heritable, passed from one generation to the next. The field suggests that trauma becomes material. Experience turns into substance that can then be transmitted to others, a literally haunting idea. This piece is called Smoke, 50 units by Mark Baker. Earthenware vessels pit-fired with discarded CPS furniture. An experimental idea in my work is based on a worry that maybe this process is exponential, like a nuclear reaction. that sadness and trauma is a sort of possession in the sense of a demon or a virus that accumulates strength and vitality and scales according to exposure. These are instruments I made for a band I put together called New Material, made mostly from a discarded bed. Fabrication assistance from Kevin Riceway. So I'm going to play a short clip from a performance we did.
Have you ever seen a night so long? Clouds go crawling by. Oh, you swear behind the clouds. Behind the clouds.
This is called CPS Xylophone by Walter Katundu, which also was featured in a few New Material performances. Trauma, like radiation, can become part of the atmosphere. So when a tragic event occurs, we are exposed to varying degrees of the viral load of trauma and sadness that then colonizes our collective DNA. An aspect of addressing trauma is to give things a proper burial, to disperse the concentration, perhaps. This is an operetta called Spectrum of Immersion that I co-wrote with Leroy Bach, featuring the vocals of soprano Sarah Lawrence here, singing an aria from Manon, a piece called Adieu, Notre Petite Table, singing goodbye to a table which is possessed by the memory of a relationship. The sound overlays the deconstruction of the There's a scene in a William Kentridge animation where a figure is shot dead and collapses on the side of the road. Then newspapers blow up against her corpse, which transforms into a rock, and life goes on around her. It's called the Chicago Archive series. As is this. Indeed, thank God that the environment around us is able to obscure the horrors that have undoubtedly occurred on every square inch of Earth. But we've constructed a sort of metaverse in which that is precisely what we experience. The vast sweeping array of human tragedy and trauma downloaded into our DNA on a daily basis through the variety of media we encounter. This is the lobby area of the MCA Chicago for an exhibition called The Freedom Principle. And the stage was made out of school desks. A bunch of performances happened. Because we are tribal creatures, there's something comforting about emotional solidarity. It is what allows for compassion, which means feeling with another, as well as all the destructive aspects of emotional contagion, like jealousy, envy, the array of prejudices that the longing for connection engenders. This is all still freedom principle. I had the opportunity to go to Italy on exchange as an undergrad in the Roman period. In the Roman Colosseum, there's a small round room, maybe 12 feet in diameter by 7 feet high, with only a hole in the floor above where prisoners would have been thrown into the cell. It's humid in the room, as if the stone walls are sweating out the history of trauma. Every spare inch has scrawls carved into it, from prisoners trying to leave a reminder of their existence, scratching into the stone with their fingernails before being fed to the lions or dispatched by some gladiator. Beast sketch carving on CPS desktop. The Apostle Paul is said to have been held in that room. The room had a profound effect on me, whether by suggestion or the empathic download that I experienced being in the room. It has haunted me ever since. It was a kitchen for a botanist, made from as many wood species as possible. W.J.T. Mitchell, another U of C fixture, writes about an experiment he does in his classrooms. He asks the students to pull out a photo of someone they love, a girlfriend or boyfriend, family member, then tells them to scratch out the eyes on the photograph. Of course, not many of us would do it. Why not? It's just a piece of paper that bears the most glancing resemblance to the person it depicts. Yet even the atheists among us would probably feel some sense of wrongness about defiling the image, because in a sense it is not just an image. It's called perfect smile. Batting removed from found dog bed and graphite. There is some sense in which the image is the person. This is the domain of the occult. Philosopher-writer Colin Wilson describes the occult as simply that latent power human beings possess to reach beyond the present. This is called Oracle 1, blueprint from a closed Chicago public school framed with found IKEA furniture. Wilson suggests that rather than an outdated superstition, the occult is a science of the future. It's called Shard 1. What does it mean for something to be haunted, for a space or object to be pervaded by trauma? This is a shot of 2 bedrooms in the Huguenot House. Theaster Gates's piece, 12 Ballads for Huguenot House, for Documenta 13, for which I was the lead fabricator. The project deconstructed materials from vacant houses on the south side of Chicago, where Theaster lives, and built furnishings for a vacant building in Kassel, Germany. This is another room in the Huguenot House, which I called Anthem Requiem, which included sound pieces. Here's a kitchen made from found materials in lath from the wall that was torn out. The whole genre of horror is based largely on the popular idea that trauma always leaves a trace. Some force, some demon remains to exact revenge, to bring justice or penance. And the reason it's frightening is because at some level we know it's true, that trauma surrounds us and that it has a grip on us. But my main issue with the genre is that the objective is often to kill the ghost, burn down the house, the monster, the thing burdened with the trauma. And this is, I think, because we remain tethered to an ancient paradigm described in part by René Girard in his scapegoat theory of redemption. These are sketches for what became my project, The Beast, at the Hyde Park Art Center. Girard suggests through his study of ancient mythology and archaic stories that human sacrifice was a norm in all parts of the world. Rituals of sacrifice, according to Girard and others, is based on the notion that trauma is contagious and pervasive, and that suffering can be displaced onto another creature or object as a way to alleviate the suffering or put it to rest. At the same time, as in Freud's idea of the death drive, voluntarily taking the suffering of privation upon oneself is one way to regain agency. Suffering that is willingly undertaken is of a very different character than that which is imposed. Just imagine jogging. The Beast was a figurative architectural intervention that to some degree manifested the idea of how trauma might impact us collectively, and a sort of proposal for how to process it. The exterior of the Beast was felt carpet underlayment wrapped over 2x4s. It felt a nod to the artist Joseph Beuys. The interior of the Beast during a spoken word event led by Chicago youth. The interior lined with CPS materials from closed schools. Garage doors open onto the street so that you can enter into the belly from the sidewalk without being aware of what sort of creature you are in. What do you do with great sadness? It breaks you. You are no longer the same person after certain experiences. You have died. Something has to happen. Suffering is a symptom looking for a cause. Every day, all day, many of us are seeking a refuge from our surplus emotions, the ones we cannot adequately process. Ritual, as someone smarter than I put it, is the art that we make for God. Through some magical ritual process, we are becoming different creatures, from apes with big brains designed to be tribalistic and to kill our food and protect our own, to creatures animated increasingly by ideas, such as love and justice, which are the collective fruit of millennia of group relations. Sacrifice emerged, as I understand it, as a sort of transfer mechanism to arrest the ambient suffering of the general population, concentrating the many vague and diffuse forms of individual suffering, pain, bad luck, violence, onto a specific target, giving a cause to the randomness of suffering. Narrative or cause is the only thing capable of making suffering tolerable. The Beast was programmed with a series of events and rituals, meetings, potlucks, music events proposed by the surrounding community. The most heartwarming development was that the local teens used the space as a sort of after-school clubhouse. But trauma is a relational designation. Two different people can experience the same event and only one of them suffers trauma, in quotes. Epigenetics seems to suggest that a trauma can even skip a generation, which I find extremely spooky. What's more, our intake of secondary trauma as compared to our ancestors is dramatically higher in one sense. We may not encounter the proximity to death as might have been normal long ago, since we have so thoroughly sanitized the death experience, but are much more highly exposed to the distant and abstract suffering that happens around the world every day. This is another version of another beast. Similar idea as the first, but made in a different setting out of retired fishing boats. This is the shot of the interior. Freud struggled with this problem, which made him abandon the idea of the pleasure principle. If something is traumatic, why repeat it? He theorizes that in some way the repetition is an attempt at incorporating the trauma into one's broader self-narrative. Repetition is like hammer blows, undermining the stability of the existing self-narrative. It's the mind's way of demanding authorship or control over the trauma. In the first case, it was done to you. In the secondary compulsion, you are doing it to yourself. Masochism is in some ways an expression of the authorial impulse. Suicide is in part a means of controlling your own narrative and denying fate. It's the Elmhurst Biennial lobby space. There are ways in which demons are easier to understand than, say, trauma or ADHD, or some bipolar disorder. The question of how we manage disturbances at an individual and collective scale has a long and checkered history. This is The Loner, fabricated from school materials for Misha Khan, with assistance from Genevieve Wolfe and Anthony Blackwood. But beyond the planetary conditions of violence that we have made some headway in minimizing, all violence is a symptom of an unwillingness or inability to experience the pain of others, or conversely, to experience it too profoundly and to want to put an end to it. It's a piece called 4228 Hermitage by Jason Lazarus. Rahm Emanuel's address made from the school materials. What continues to interest me is the relationship between the religious spiritual impulse and its relationship to matter. Somehow, in the billions of years that life has been on Earth, something happened that afforded the possibility of consciousness, or the ability to be aware of oneself as if looking from outside. But we remain animals in a significant sense, maybe with the capacity to become human beings. There are competing definitions of consciousness, of what are we trying to become conscious? Or is it just some accidental and necessary outcome of a certain level of cellular complexity? This is a tent designed for the Taste of Chicago Cultural Center Art Garden. Here's the interior of the tent. These cubes were made with a whole group of Chicago artists and designers collaborating. One way that has been suggested to think of consciousness in terms of what it might be like to be that thing. What's it like to be a bat? What's it like to be a table? It is probably safe to assume that a table does not think to itself what it is like to be a table, and what it might be like to be something else. And we can wonder if complex creatures like mammals think about themselves, or if they are essentially synonymous with their mood, their emotions, or state of being. And are those of us who are entirely entrenched in our emotions similar to a wolf, for whom there is no gap between the emotion and the action? To paraphrase the philosopher Martin Heidegger, the human creature is the being for whom being is a problem. It's certainly interesting to try and imagine otherwise, and the idea of panpsychism, once considered spiritualist quackery, is now sincerely uttered by respected physicists and analytic philosophers. The idea that consciousness does not end and begin with humans, but that it's a sort of spectrum that stretches into animals and even matter. Human consciousness, in this view, is just a particular flavor of the broader self-awareness of the universe. This is a skilled replica of Martin Heidegger's writing hut made from salvaged fencing. Does a wolf feel compassion for the rabbit? There's a sense in which compassion derives from the capacity to imagine yourself as something other than what you are. The same is true of deceit. And once able to perform such an occult procedure, how then does communication happen from one isolated planet to the next? Thinking of individual consciousnesses as planets. This is a replica of Ludwig Wittgenstein's Norwegian writing hut made from salvaged cedar fencing. The philosopher Simon Critchley says, philosophy begins with disappointment. Maybe art does too. The world that we want or wish for is not the world that is available to us. And art begins in part as a means of composing the world we want instead, or the ways in which we want to change the one we have inherited, and the unique and strange condition that places humans in, to imagine worlds that do not yet exist and maybe never will. Wittgenstein, interior. The condition of humans, then, is to construct a world out of the ideas that have possessed us. Ideas are demons, pure and simple, good and bad. Ideas possess us, not the other way around. Sink Dorchester projects. And because ideas possess us, it is not crazy to imagine that trauma influences the ideas that live in the ether and enter our imaginations. Trauma haunts the world into being. And the question then of how to transform trauma to redeem the hauntedness of the world is the primary religious and occult project. Dining set from school materials. Toward that end, we are constantly in the process of producing, one, blueprints and narratives to suggest where we are going. This piece is a modest inquiry into the nature of witchcraft. Bench made from school materials and felt. Number two, rituals and practices. What are the productive means of bringing the world that we want into being? This is Stoop 6. Faux fur, felt, leather, harvested from trashed couches. And three, what do we do with the people that disagree with us? This is an installation at the Harris School of Public Policy. There's an imagined text called the Akashic Record, the ur-text behind all other texts, the blueprint for every occult phenomenon that comes after it. This is Blueprint Chapel, Heilbronn, Germany, bench made from found IKEA cabinet. The blueprints are necessarily infused into the existing landscape at every turn, legible in shards and scraps. This is Virtue Signal 1, lamp made of school materials and blueprints. Collaboration with Kevin Reiswig. Much like how physicists speculate on the origins of life and the planet by recasting the movement of matter and light, the idea of an Akashic record is a sort of linguistic and theological theory of the origins of various universal human impulses and from whence they came. This is Oracle 4, school blueprint soaked in oil for translucency, mounted on plexi. Rituals might be those practices that create the conditions for clarity of imagination, such that the collective hauntedness that pervades reality does not overwhelm our capacity to process it. In short, ritual is the thing to which we give our attention. Attention is spiritual currency. Stoop 7, found textiles, school materials. And policy and politics is the realm of how we manage disagreement. What we do with the people who do not agree with us. This is a stage set at the Harris School, which would have had a lot of performances on it, but COVID hit right at the time this was completed. My project Infinite Games, of which you've already seen a few images, pictured here at Open House Contemporary, an apartment gallery and rental in River West, was in part an exploration of this conundrum. The title came from the term by James Carse, which he coined as a sort of theological exploration of game theory, but run through a filter of Simon Critchley's idea of an infinite ethical demand. Finite games have winners and losers. Infinite games are the kind in which prolonging the game is the objective. Games such as life, love, relationship, politics. The project was meant to invite other artists and designers to make work with the vast supply of school materials, to expand the scope of the project and create projects and collaborations throughout the city on the themes of giving voice outside of my little universe, and to explore the moral disjunction or systemic misalignment between the proposed objectives and the class divisions that might make those objectives difficult or impossible. This is two pieces by Parsons and Charlesworth. If we refer back to the occult objective to create blueprints, rituals, and modes of discipline and enforcement for unhaunting the world, the degree of ambient trauma present in one life versus another will dramatically impact the capacity to create imaginary space for alternatives. On the left is Ink by Inigo Manglano Ovalle, print made from the ink, made from carbon, made from ash, made from burning a school chair. Piece on the right is Doorstop by Matthew Metzger. Furthermore, every space has its own associative dimension that impacts the reception of work shown within that space and the sort of work made for it. Some of us acquiesce to the likelihood that we are making work for our colleagues and for possible future generations. Some of us are restless, wanting to open conversations outside of traditional art spaces. Some of us have no patience for such spaces and their incentive structure and try to create our own circuits. The circuit I find myself interested in is the one which has placed me at times on opposing sides of the velvet rope, so to speak, such that I have a view from both sides of the rope. This is a phonograph by Marvin Tate, school bench with pencils, phonograph, and record. Surrounded by untitled seat cushions by Karen Reimer. Having had the opportunity to make my own work, make work for other artists for whom I have great respect, to collaborate with other artists, and to have other artists helping me to make my work, all contributes to my broader conviction of where the value in art making lies. For me, it is in the way a project, a vision, an idea can connect a widely disparate group of people under a common banner and common objective. Very little in the world feels better to me than an ambitious project among similarly committed peers. This is the Left Behind series by artist Alberto Aguilar. Memorial, Phoenix, Arizona on the left, Iowa rest stop on the right. Photographic documentation of temporary installations throughout the country with the school materials. Below that, Stacks on Stacks on Stacks by Amanda Williams. School maps painted onto pegboard from the closed schools. Gold leaf. But the question of how art is made remains a complex and interesting and sometimes troubling one. A quote from art and craft historian Glenn Adamson. I quote, "I am always struck by contemporary art's dysfunctional relationship with its own forms of production. My guess is that historians in 50 years will look back at our moment and prioritize the systems of making prevalent in the art world, not the content or imagery or ideas. There isn't an honest conversation about this at the moment." Unquote. On the left, the stack on the table is Dan Peterman, 40-foot shipping containers, intermodal. The little blocks are scaled to the size of a shipping container. And on the right, I Love You Always, Eric Peterson, neon rendering of text found scrawled into chair. What has often troubled me is the collision between art's performative versus its exhibition function. I've operated in the circuit of production and appreciation that is largely about social ills that none of us in the circuit directly experiences. And in the desire to make a legible impact on some issue or other, it can be tempting, and in some cases a marvelous achievement, to drift into activism or direct action. This is unbordered Jeremy Boyle puzzle made from school furniture. But by and large, I don't think of art as the most efficacious tool for diagnosing social ills. In my opinion, art will always and should always avoid completely identifying with its own forms of production. It's true that part of what makes a social practice collective, like, say, Wokenklausur, interesting is the pragmatism of their interventions. Rather than wild speculative recalibrations of the world or imaginative reframings of reality, they are Boy Scout-like interventions in social space. I just use them as an example of a sort of activist-oriented practice, like helping get health care for sex workers in Vienna, helping get a municipal skate park location settled after years of debate. Who knows? Is it valuable? Without question. Is it art? I think of it as both a simple and beautiful interpretation of what art can be, imagining social space as material in the Joseph Beuys-ian lineage, but a kind of dead end at the same time. This is You Love Me Too by Iris Bernbloom, melted crayons on a plastic school chair. The left one is First Chair, Douglas Ewart. Douglas did a series of performances on this chair. On the right, Should I Stay or Should I Go? Peter Fleps, luggage made from school desks and felt. Left is Untitled by Juan Chavez. Right is I Was Folklore, Titus Wanzi, school materials cast in soap, installed in one of the showers. There's no place to stand that is free of the associative trauma that pervades the material and social world. I don't think we can unhaunt the world. Evil wants to be heard. Evil can't be killed or eradicated because it is attached to the very capacity that allows us to imagine we could be or do something other than what we are. We are shapeshifters. The poet admires the dedication of the laborer, who worships the athlete, who wants to be more like her mother, who lives for her children, who loves superheroes and princesses, who protect the helpless, who covet the visibility of the celebrity, who perish without the adoration of the abstract multitudes. This is called Ladder, school materials, fabrication assistance from Eva Preus. We cannot but misread the world into being. Culture is the accumulation of human error. Art is a full-throated instantiation of religion, as the narrative history of our misperception of reality. Art is a contract negotiation with time. Art is a plea bargain, a temporary stay of execution. Art making is devotional idolatry, sounding the idols, as Nietzsche put it. This is impact statement letters made from school. Art is the evangelical fervor of a drug-addled priest. Art is the anxious mumbling of uncertain clients in a waiting room, the practice of controlling chaos, the conditional practice of losing control while maintaining eye contact with the audience. Art is an admission of guilt and its insincere repentance that comes with the warm feeling of having said something interesting. But you rejoice as if you produced the idea out of whole cloth, when really you had the momentary wherewithal to grab hold of it like an anchor when it stumbled haplessly into your mind, the mind that you have on loan from the Cosmic Library, because we know that art will always be a reckless underestimation of what is at stake, but might be as close as we get to hitting the mark. Stoop 8. But within all of the chaos and trauma, there are habits, there are rituals, there are practices, there's warmth and joy, there's accidental beauty, there's the wild, untethered elation of love, there's the capacity on occasion for a collective landscape to open up between people of goodwill, a church of sorts, lending a multiplier effect to our capacities as the beings for whom their own nature is the most mysterious of subjects. This is the neutralized third, collaboration with my fiancée, Genevieve Wolf. The end. Thank you very much. All right. Well, I think we have time for
Q&A. Anyone
Q&A.
want to jump in?
Anybody wants to talk about anything, ask me some questions?
When did the relationship with the school materials begin? Is that something that, I'm just curious what that process and how it's evolved over the years?
It began, well, actually it began, so 2013 is when the huge closing happened, and then there were, that's where I got the load of 6 semi-loads of material that's been worked its way into a lot of work since then. I also, when I worked for quite a while with Theaster Gates, and there was a load of furniture that we had, and it worked its way into some of his projects, some of my projects, in like, I think that was 2011, 2012. Some of that material ended up at the installation. You saw pictures of in Documenta in Germany also. Sorry, was there another question after that?
No, I mean, how is it, has the relationship changed, like working with that material for so long? It's just,
Yeah,
about
yeah.
how it's evolved.
It has. It's evolved. I think when my first interaction with it, you know, I treated, like, so much of my work is with found material or things I pick up here and there, collect. And I treated it as just sort of another version of that without any particular, I don't think at the beginning, the kind of political, emotional freight that was carried in the material didn't strike me as profoundly early on as it did as I continued to work with it and have conversations with other artists and other people about it. The experience of incorporating it into the beast at first was kind of like it happened to be available and the whole thing was made out of stuff I found. But then it really, through that process, like I think I started to think about it much more in terms of its historical memory and how it might hold on to that and release it and give us access to certain stories. Yeah, so it's, but I think I've been working with it now for so long that I'm kind of trying to set it aside at this point.
Just to follow up on that a little bit, can you speak to, you mentioned, or you asked posed the question, what does it mean for something to be haunted?
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could kind of speak about your use of reclaimed objects, like that particular lens of not just, repictualized objects like having history, but specifically this idea of like being haunted.
I really just started using that word fairly recently when thinking about it, in part because I feel like there's a way in which that trope of horror movies, for instance, where there's this remainder always of trauma, which is the ghost or the haunted house or the whatever. it's like a direct illustration of an idea that seems to be suggested at a much more subterranean level through studies of psychology and group psychology. And my sense, and I think it also speaks to something like when I described that room in the Coliseum, an experience that I had. But it's also just a way of getting at the way psychology and material get connected, and thinking about that, sort of a language for thinking about that. Of course, there can be good haunting too, right? It has a sort of downcast to it, but it struck me as a really interesting way to think about that relationship. How do human experience translate into material and then back into other humans? And yeah.
Is exorcism a word you use at all? Kind of the
I
power
like that word, but I haven't used it a lot. Yeah. There was a part in here about exorcism. I just learned recently that the Catholic Church still does them, but they call it something else now. I can't remember what they call it. They don't call it an exorcism anymore, but it's still part of practice. So, yeah. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about the nature of your various collaborations and how they've emerged and been executed?
Yeah. Well, I've had many different types of working relationships, from being, solo monastic hermit in my studio to being, to working with, like when I first graduated from here, I collaborated with another artist, Sarah Black, that was a student here at the same time. We worked together for maybe 5 years, and then everything we did was just kind of co-authored, and we collaborated with other people also. But David Wolf was part of that too. Many of the students here will know him. And then when I worked with Theaster Gates for a while, there was some conversation about it being a collaboration, but then it wasn't. And then I was, in other cases, just more like I fabricate work for him. And that relationship went through various iterations, but and then I've had people that make work for me, so I will be, give a certain set of conditions, or in some cases it's very specific. In other cases it's elaborating on a theme, and trying to name those people when they've been present in my projects. And then there are projects like Infinite Games or The Beast that involve a ton of other artists or designers or musicians. And I think, as I mentioned, a big part of what makes making art work exciting to me is trying to figure out ways to combine forces, bring people in my life or in people from very different walks of life into the same room, kind of with a common objective. I find that to be a really exciting aspect of collaboration. The other part of it, I think my work has changed dramatically from working with all these different people. You get to see how they make decisions and question your own impulses and so forth. So I think for me, it's been a very motivating factor for keep myself making work.
So,
Yeah.
can I ask, process, your making process, what kind of choices you make, when you're working with something that you're repurposing. Yeah, like just the material choices and how you use the material, how you cut the wood down, whether you add to it, like what you change, if you give yourself boundaries. I just want to know a little bit more about how you had it in the studio when you're working with this material.
Yeah. They become very literal in a lot of ways. So, I mean, I think that's part of why I'm still so tethered to furniture making in a way, because you have, like I can easily become paralyzed by writer's block if it's just a blank page in front of me. So there's a way in which working with found stuff, you already have something to react to, which to me feels like, I'm already on a slope when I get on the bike. There's something going on already that then I get to respond to, so it's more of a conversation. And I think a lot of the work that I make is part of what animates it, is the sense of it being a conversation and with the material, with the history in that material, with what it's going to be used for eventually. And I think, when I sort of listen incessantly to podcasts, like the form of people talking to each other, working through something is endlessly interesting to me, rather than just reading a text. So it's something about the back and forth, I think, that, as I talked in some of the studio visits earlier, a lot of my, I'm not the kind of artist that just goes into the studio every day and makes stuff. It's very much focused around specific projects that might take months or years to kind of imagine and figure out the logistics, and then figure out how to actually do the thing and all the different elements of it that interest me. But yeah, when I'm in the shop, it's just like, looks like a woodworker, I suppose.
Can you curious about like balancing the practice of being a fabricator with an artistic practice? Can you talk about the adaptation?
Yeah, I mean, that was sort of an accidental development. I didn't set out to be a fabricator, it just sort of, so early on, like when I graduated here, I was interested in teaching, but it means you have to adjunct for years and years for a lot of people, and I had kids, I couldn't really afford to do that, so I kind of went back to being a furniture maker, and met Dan Peterman, who's an artist who also went here, was right there, and he gave me all kinds of work in his building, and pretty soon I was fabricating work for him, and then met Theaster and started working on his house, and then as I'm working on his house, I say, hey, make me a shoe shine stand or whatever. So it just sort of developed out of my particular skill set and the people I was making work for, so it's accidental. And, in some cases, like they're very different kinds of fabrication. For instance, making work for Dan Peterman, like he told me everything, like where the screw holes go, where the, I'm not making any kind of creative decisions on his behalf. With Theaster, it's more like, hey, make me this sort of thing, and then I wouldn't see him for 2 weeks. So there's a very different way, and that was more fun in a way, but also more confusing in terms of like, whose thing is this? And that's sort of interesting to like try to find the line there. And I think when I've had other people make work for me, it's been similar, where I'm, trying to give credit where it's due, but also, certain things, I'm the one making the decisions in somebody else's hands because I don't have time or whatever. But I think it's a very fraught universe. Like you're going to get a million stories from other fabricators about whether or not they feel like their work is being acknowledged, or their hand in it is part of the story or not. And different artists have very different ways of talking about that. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about the title for the speech called theology? Could you talk a little bit about the title, why the title?
Why? Yeah. I guess having grown up in a religious background, I ran away from that for a long time, didn't want all that much to do with it. And as I get older, it feels to me like so much of how I think about whatever I'm doing is completely contained within my religious language and upbringing. And at the same, I don't have any formal training whatsoever. It's just experiential, and I haven't read a whole ton about what religion is. And in a sense, I feel like it has a way of, I'll be working on something or thinking about a project, and then at some point it's like, oh, that's just like this religious story that I remember from being a kid, or and it's somehow found its way into how I'm thinking about some material that I'm working with or something like that. So the idea of pulp being like popular, like I'm not bringing scholarly erudition to the subject, but it's something I think about all the time. Yeah.
What's the origin or the seed pieces? It seems so recognizable as tree stuff.
Yeah.
That's a series.
That was a piece, so, that's the first set of those I made for Theaster, and they ended up in the Huguenot House. And then I was invited to propose something for a show that was going to be like a screening room for video work. So it was like thinking about seating and how many people needed to sit, and so I made a whole series of those as, the initial idea behind them was just interesting to think about this stoop as a sort of popular neighborhood meeting place where people used to kind of hang out with their neighbors, and kind of a outward-facing sense of your connection to your community, which I think is kind of unusual at this point. And so it's like this mannered version of that by upholstering it and turning it into a piece of furniture, which I think a lot of things we have in our world are like that. They're sort of